on that. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for listening to me babble a little bit there. So let's share our screen and get this presentation started. Let's go to, whoop. All right. So the name of this presentation, though much is taken, much abides, Sustaining Memory, the Native American Studies Archive at USC Lancaster. I was at Myrtle Beach one year. I was laying on the beach and I think I was drinking some sort of frou-frou drink and I was reading a sci-fi novel. And all of a sudden there was a poem in there called Ulysses, written by Tennyson, who I didn't know much about. And this is a line from that poem, though much is taken, much abides. It was talking about old age, but it just struck me. It just struck me strongly. And I'm like, that's a Native American experience in South Carolina. Though much is taken, much abides. And it seemed an incredibly appropriate title for this presentation. Now, this is an image. This is a wonderful Chris Judge photograph. I hope eventually we're going to have a Chris Judge photograph exhibit here because he takes great pictures. But this is at the Unity Powwow in Columbia back in 2010. They used to do it at the State House, which I really liked because that day the Native Americans went back and took Columbia back for a day. But this is very much at the Canal Park. And this is several of our tribal leaders there. There's the leaders of 4 different tribes in this picture here. And these are some of these forceful personalities, these warriors that we've met that are strong advocates for their people. So let's see, let's go to my next slide. Let me just get my hand up here. All right, so this is a map. This is from the Commission of Minority Affairs, and this is the Native American entities in South Carolina. Most people don't know it in South Carolina. I'm from the upstate. We don't know anybody Native American exists in the state hardly. It's kind of sad, Spartanburg, Greenville County. But there are about 13 state recognized tribes. There's 1 federally recognized tribes. We've got recognized groups, and there's over 50,000 people in our state that identify as Native Americans. A lot of these groups kind of emerged in the 1980s. They had been kind of living in their own little enclaves throughout the state, you know, living a quiet existence. And there's an amazing story there for the history of these groups. But many of them emerged in the 1980s, claimed a Native American identity. It was a long time in South Carolina before we had legislation. It's only been legal for several years now for an Indian chief to marry his people, for an Indian to have turkey feathers that they can use in their headdress. There's still a lot of terrible inequities in Native Americans as far as their relationships and things that happen in our state. But this is who we serve. These are our mission. This is our mission group. So here's our mission statement: to acquire, preserve, catalog, organize, digitize, and disseminate information relating to Native American peoples with emphasis on South Carolina and the surrounding areas. This is my mission statement. This is my mantra. This is kind of what I work with. And here are the basic obligatory quotes from some of the giants in my field. The archive can be a repository for captured memory of the past, a location for future preservation and access, and an agent for cultural preservation and power. And the next one is an older quote, but it really still resonates strongly today. Archives, along with other communication resources such as oral and ritual tradition, help to transfer information and thereby sustain memory from generation to generation. And this is what the whole purpose and goal of what I do here is. So here's a little snapshot. We're not big, but we're growing. We've got 13 collections. We've got about 280 linear feet of material, 5,500 letters, 7,000 slides, 5,000 photographs, 1,000 plus journals, 170 hours of oral history recordings, about 15 to 20 hours of video, 1,000 plus monographs. Monograph is just a fancy librarian word for book, but 1,000 monographs sounds a lot cooler than 1,000 books. And extensive materials on the Catawba, the Monacan, the Pamunkey, the Petey, the several Petey groups, the Nachi, Santee, Sumter, Wassimasaw. So a lot of these groups, a lot of other groups. Dr. Blumer was very interested in the Pamunkey Indians of Virginia, who recently got their federal recognition after being on their reservation for over 300 years. And so we have a nice chunk of materials there. So these are just kind of a brief overview of what we have. And then this is my main collection page with the names of just what we have. We made efforts to collect papers from Native Americans. We also made efforts to collect papers from individuals who were prominent in Native American studies research in our area. And this is like the Jean Crediford, the Alice Kasakoff, the Westtalk Juray. So just a kind of a cross section of things. We've got one digital gallery up here that I did several years ago. It's got about 130 Catawba Indian slides and photographs. It's been very heavily used over the years. It's up on the South Carolina Digital Library. I keep a list of new books that are added to the archive. The books don't circulate, a lot of them that are rare and out of print, but we do that. And then I've got a couple of reference materials here. I have a South Carolina Native American Entities reference file, and this is kind of what we used to call a vertical file in the old days. I've got a folder on every tribe in South Carolina, all the Catawbas, and anytime there's a new paper, a new scholarly thing, their tribal newsletters, I continue to add these to here. So we've got a growing body of materials on them. And finally, I've got a genealogical listing because so many people get in touch with me wanting to trace their bloodline, and try to find out if they are related to the tribe. Some of the people do these for good purposes. Others think they are going to get something free, and I kind of find that disheartening. I'm excited for the Catawba about them having their casino that's being constructed now, and I think it will do wonderful things for the tribe if it all comes to fruition. I'm a little worried at the time that are we going to have hundreds and hundreds of people calling us trying to see if they can somehow join the Catawba tribe because they can get a cut of casino money. That might sound a little cold to say that, but we might be overwhelmed if that's the way it goes. But it's still early days, so we're going to see where that goes. So this is just a snapshot, but I get a lot of genealogical requests, and I love helping people with that sort of thing. Where did it begin? It all began with a man named Dr. Tom Blumer. There's no doubt that Tom Blumer was brilliant. Tom Blumer was also difficult. Matter of fact, he was one of the most difficult donors in the history of South Carolina archives, according to some of my fellow professionals. And maybe I shouldn't say that, but it's true. He did wonderful things. He worked for the Library of Congress for many, many years. And he very early on became interested in the Catawba Indians, and he began making trips to the reservation, and he began recording their history, and he became obsessed with Catawba pottery. So he saved so many cultural memories and reflections that we would have otherwise lost and never had. So his legacy is very solid, and he saved history that probably wouldn't have made it. So I think Dr. Stephen Criswell, who's actually our director here, wrote this a long time ago. Contains a wide-ranging group of materials amassed by the donor over a 40-year period. These materials are significant and unique. Dr. Blumer's efforts have ensured that valuable Native American remembrances and cultural history will endure. So the Blumer collection, the Blumer pottery collection, which later came to us, are the foundation of everything we've done here since. We've grown tremendously since that time and amassed a lot more archival materials, a lot more collections and things like that. But he was the start. And his collection contains everything: photographs, slides, legal and administrative materials, oral histories, correspondence, monographs, published works, diaries and journals, topical files, including clippings and ephemera. Ephemera is just one of these cool archival words that means something that's not normally that you would keep, like a ball ticket or a church program, something that gives us a snapshot of a moment in time. So ephemera is cool. You never know what you're going to get that way in the archival world. Let's start off with the correspondence. I've got 4,300 letters from Dr. Blumer. And the wonderful thing about his correspondence is normally in the archival profession, you'll have letters, but they're always letters that were sent to whoever donated that collection. We never have copies of the letters that the donor sent to whoever the letter came from. So we've got two-way correspondence here, and it's just amazing. Probably one of the greatest Catawba potters of the 1900s was a lady named Georgia Harris. And there are 1,100 letters between Georgia and Tom. And it's just like a 30-year weekly snapshot of everything that's happening on the reservation. It's just wonderful documentary history. There's all sorts of where Georgia talks about her family, her relatives, her mom. And you got to realize when Tom was talking to Georgia, Georgia was old. She was already in her 78 and 80s. She'd been born in the early 1900s. She was giving us memories and reflections from her parents who went back into the 18th century, a good 40, 50, 60 years. And so we've got a lot of memories there and reflections of what the Catawba would call the old Indians, a lot of the ancestors. So it gives us a really look back into the 1800s. We've got a lot of Pamunkey correspondence. There's some Cherokee correspondence in there. And Dr. Blumer also corresponded with all sorts of experts in the field. I've got about 3 boxes of correspondence from him. And I hate to say it's taken about 10 years to do it, but I'm finally about ready to start indexing that too. I know that we've got letters in there from like Joffrey Coe, who was like the legendary North Carolina archaeologist that is incredibly famous. And I don't know what other gems I might have in there. I'm looking forward to doing that. You know, and to take it aside a minute and sound kind of hokey, the truly wonderful thing about being an archivist, and yeah, this sounds hokey, but it really is like Forrest Gump and chocolate. I never know what I'm going to get, okay? That doesn't mean it might be bad. I've gotten a box of mold before, and one time I got a box of spiders. So somebody gave me a collection that had 4 or 5 black widows jumping around in it. But it over and all in all, it's wonderful. Photographs. These are beautiful. There's over 3,000 images in the photographs of Tom Blumer. Here's a wonderful shot of the old Catawba Indian Ferry, which went away in 1959. But, you know, there's so many accounts of people driving the car up to the ferry. That's how you cross the river from York County to Lancaster County, the Catawba River. And I love the little bateau here, or bateau, I'm not sure how you say that word. But this is the sort of images. Dr. Blumer got all sorts of old photographs of the Catawba that were in the Smithsonian, that were in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Bureau of American Ethnology, the American Philosophical Association, some Ivy League colleges, and he just amassed a huge collection. And that's what I have here. If you're a Catawba Indian, you can come in here and I can pull up a recording of your great-grandmother talking. I can give you photographs of your family, maybe going back 125, 50 years. It's just a wonderful resource. Slides. The slides, you know, I had some students come in here the other day, not too long ago, and I had a box of these, and they're like, what are those? And I'm like, these are slides. And I felt so incredibly old. They didn't have a clue. And I was like, you know, your PowerPoint lecture with the slides? Well, this is what a slide really is. And they're like, oh. And then they were holding them up to the light. They were looking through them. They're like, this is so cool. This is so cool. And I'm like thinking, if you only knew, slides are an archivist's nightmare. On the one hand, they are incredibly long lasting. They're one of the best preserved things. A good slide, if it's kept in a decent environmental condition, will last 50, 75 years. But scanning them is a long and rough process. So originally we paid Dr. Blumer to do a finding aid for all 5,725 slides. I had to renumber them. It wasn't that fun. But at the end of the day, his finding aid was just, it wasn't good. I mean, he would say, Georgia Harris, Georgia Harris, Georgia Harris. So if you're searching this finding aid, trying to find out how to find anything on it, it's not going to be much good to you if there's 5,725 slides and 800 of them say Georgia Harris. Only the most serious researcher is going to use that. The average Joe just looking for information is going to throw his hands up, say to heck with this, and walk off. So I came up with a more comprehensive way to arrange this topically. I've got through about the first 2,000. This will probably be a job tackled by my successor. And I must admit, for those of you that are professionals in any field, there's something somewhere in your office you open up, you look at, you shiver, and you close the door. And the slides condition has been a little bit like this for us. But slowly but surely, we're getting this knocked out, and work continues on these. I'm thinking about getting a grant to maybe have a student scan the rest of these, but still describing them as a process. Legal and administrative. You know, the Catawbas have sued South Carolina and the federal government for 100 years easily for the taking of their 1763 to 1840 reservation. I don't know if any of you can see it, but here's the old map of the Catawba Indian Reservation, which was established in 1840 when they were kind of forced to cede their land and lasted until 1943. It still exists, but this is where you can see the old diamond-shaped Catawba Indian boundary there. And that's why South Carolina has that funny bump in it up around below Charlotte. It was because we encompassed the original Catawba Reservation. You know, something else I didn't say that everyone should know that I should have just shouted out at the start of this presentation. I can't remember which University of North Carolina doctor it was without the slide in front of me. I'm sorry, it's another PowerPoint. But in 1700, it was estimated there were between 8 and 10,000 Catawbas. In 1800, there were 120 Catawba Indians. So in a century, we go from 8 to 10,000 to 120. The story of the Catawba Indian Nation is one of the greatest stories of survival in the history of the human race and in the history of the human world. And that's why we should know in South Carolina more about the Catawba and more about South Carolina's native people. Back to the presentation. Oral histories. You know, this is a wonderful quote from Adolph Dial, who was a legendary Lumbee scholar out in coastal plains of North Carolina, and Dr. David Eliades. And while it is fashionable among some historians to attack oral history as inherently imprecise and largely inaccurate, yet they willingly use memoirs written years after the fact or documents that have been intentionally or unintentionally edited. Where's the justice? The objective of any historical study is idealistically truth. Should not all sources be explored and utilized in pursuit of this goal? There is, in many ways, still a kind of tendency by a lot of academics to kind of put oral histories down. Oh, they don't remember. They made this up, blah, 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 which greatly angers me because a lot of things are passed down oral history-wise. Among Native American people, even today, there is more of a tendency to pass things down oral-wise than necessarily to write it down or record it. This is an enduring Native American tradition that exists very much in Native American culture today. And that is another reason it makes it so incredibly important to get these reflections. And I will say with Native American studies, we've tried our best to get out and interview South Carolina's Native American peoples, to record their stories, and that is something we continue to do. But we're still in the Blumer collection here. The interviews begin in 1971. There's extensive documentation on Catawba life and culture in the early 19th century and in the present day. When I first got here, I had a huge box of about, 150 cassette tapes. The young people have never had the joy of throwing a cassette tape out of the window after the tape player ate it, but it's a very, very unstable form of preservation. If they're too hot, they stretch. If they're too cold, they crack. The data becomes unstable. You may have one pass before it's gone forever. So when I took this job many years ago, my first concern was to digitize these tapes and save them before they were forever gone. I had a lot of help at the South Caroliniana, and McKissick, later Sadler's Taylor, did the large majority of these for us. And so we got them all converted to a CD format. And unfortunately, I need to spool them over into something else now. But that means that they're preserved and out there. Still a lot of work to convert an oral history into a transcription. It's very labor intensive. but we continue to add these. Monographs, here's those books. You can see these are all Bureau of American Ethnology. These are a lot of ancient reports. Some of these are a century-old. Some of these are from the 1880s. And yes, most of these are available online, but it's so cool to have them on my shelf and to go over there and touch them. And we have a lot of books here. We're a non-circulating repository, but I have a lot of books here that are rare, out of print, hard to find, that might have Native American materials in them that just don't exist anywhere else. And here are the topical files in the Blumer collection. Got about 25 linear feet of virtually everything. In the academic world nowadays, and in the K through 12 world, when that student's writing a paper, we tell them to get the most contemporary journal article. Well, it doesn't necessarily work like this in our field. We want the journal article that was written 100 years ago, that is a lot closer to the Native Americans that come from a different era of time than our Native Americans now. And the oldest journal article I have was written in 1918. And it's still incredibly relevant for a lot of research materials today. Another thing I did, Dr. Blumer had amassed a lot of graphical files on the Catawbas and Pamunkeys and Cherokee tribal members. I got a student. We went on Ancestry.com and we printed off every death certificate we could find, which was disheartening. People were dying in the 1940s on the Catawba Reservation of cholera. We got a lot of kind of disheartening things like that. I went on to Ancestry.com. I created a big spreadsheet that's got all the Catawba World War I draft cards, which gives us tremendous information about who was working then and where they were working at. They were working at the textile mills. So these biographical files do. When someone dies, we create a folder if we don't have one on them, and we continue to add. So there's a lot of amazing information in here. You can come in and say, well, my grandfather was Marvin George. And I'm like, well, here's his wife. There's this oral history he did. Here's photographs of them. Here's newspaper clippings about him. I can pretty well give you a dossier on your ancestor. And so this is a part of the collection that continues to grow. I've got files existing for 36 other tribes with extensive Cherokee, Pamunkey, Monacan. They're up near Jerry Falwell country in Virginia. And I've got active files established for all South Carolina Native American entities. So, there's so much information here. So that's kind of the Blumer collection. That was the foundation of everything that we did. But here's what we've done since. Garfield Harris was a Catawba. He was an amazing individual. And he has journals and diaries, and he would just kind of record everyday event. Garfield Harris frustrates me tremendously in one aspect. He wrote an autobiography, just kind of short snippets of his life. And he wrote something, I can't remember the exact year now, but I think he said in 1928 or 29, I fell in love with Olga. And Olga was a white woman. He was a Catawba. He said, but because I was an Indian and she was a white person, we couldn't be married. So this is 1929. The next line he writes, but in 1945, when I came home from the war, we got married. I've never, ever gonna know what the heck happened in the 16 years in between. That's quite incredibly frustrating for me. But he was an amazing man. When he was in World War II, there was a horrible irony. They sent him out to Manzanar, and he was guarding the Asian Americans, the Japanese, that we had put in internment camps. So here he is, a persecuted American minority guarding another persecuted American minority. And then here's another note that he has. He said, while I was there, I watched the Navajo across the valley practicing their signals. He watched the Navajo code talkers practicing. So these are some kind of the little treasures we find. And there's all sorts of stories on the Catawba Reservation about Garfield Harris and who he was and how when he got old, Olga and him would ride around the reservation at about 5 miles an hour. Just a well-remembered individual. I love this photograph of him and his brother going into World War II. So thanks to him, we really have some important reflections. Monty Branham is another Catawba. Monty's lived a fascinating life, a paratrooper, actually worked for Dale Earnhardt's pit crew for a long time. But he's definitely a visionary, and he's done some important work tribal-wise. We have some very interesting documents he's given us here. And so just nice. This isn't a large collection, but it has some very wonderful stuff in it. And Rosemary. I gotta say too, most archivists, you just get a set of papers and the people die or dead. I mean, they don't die, they have died already. So, and you may feel like you get to know them through their papers. But here, mostly for the large part, I've got to meet my donors. I've got to forge a personal relationship with them. And I've written all of my deed of gifts to be open-ended. So like somebody may give me something 3 years later to add to their collection, and I just receipt it and we do it. That way we don't have to go through all the bureaucracy of doing another deed of gift. Rosemary Whitlock was a longtime Lancaster resident, and Rosemary found out later in life that she was a Monacan Indian. And there's a huge thing here. You know, her family moved away from the area because they could pass for white. Because in the 1920s, there was a guy named Plecker in Virginia, and he changed every birth certificate from Indian to black. He said they were all black. They didn't have any native blood. You know, it was a very difficult thing for people. Plecker had a lot of ideas. It's even postulated that Hitler got some of his eugenics ideas from Plecker in the state of Virginia. And I think that there's some truth to this. But Rosemary reconnected with her Monacan people. She went up there and she didn't know any of them. She reconnected with them. And then she actually created a set of oral history interviews, which I have here. And she wrote a book. And Native people, yes, there's a lot of academics and scholars that write out there about Native people, but I've always said that Native people need to tell their own Native story. So Rosemary just did a masterful job, and it's just a wonderful thing. She got to be a great friend too. I mean, if Rosemary came to the archive, we were going to hug. And she passed away recently, and I really miss her. But because of her, the Monacan Indians have recorded history that no one would have never known about. And they also just became federally recognized very recently. And so I can't wait. And this is something we're going to get around to before long, to have a dialogue with the tribal leadership so we can share some of the photographs, the papers, the historical documentation we have here that will help this tribe moving on into the future. Fred Sanders, Catawba Fred Sanders. There's just not enough words to talk about this man. He was a fighter for his people. He was longtime vice chief of the Catawba Indian Nation. He was a huge part of the Catawbas regaining federal recognition in 1993. And I have about 20 linear feet of materials from him. And this is the largest collection of archival materials ever assembled by a South Carolina Native American. And these papers are incredibly important because the correspondence he has in here with so many different individuals that are well known in Indian country, and the groups and the things. I mean, okay, how do you create a tribal government? You know, a federally recognized Indian tribe is an autonomous government within the United States. How do you create a tribal government? It's all documented in Fred Sanders' papers. And there's just so much stuff in here. I keep hoping that I'm going to have, I've had some tribal members come in and review a lot of his documents and papers over time, but this is just a legal treasure trove, and there's just so many things here. Claude Chavis is a PD Indian. I haven't got around to processing this collection yet, but he wrote a biography on his people. Also did a lot of other interesting work. He also donated some of his things that he had made here. This is over in Chris Judge's area of the Native American Studies Center. And if you'll notice, there's a pistol there. Well, Claude put a powder charge in it and fired it off in Chris's area one day. This is where Brent Burgin made the somewhat disconcerting personal self-discovery that he would run to the sound of a gunshot if it went off near him, which I don't think bodes well. But Claude donated papers to us. He's since deceased too, had some bad diabetes problems, I think. But once again, we've got some documents on the PD, who are a group of 2 or 3 different tribes, South Carolina tribes, and these are important things to have also. Now we go back in time a little bit. In the 1970s, there was a gentleman named Steve Baker. He was a history major. He later went on to become an archaeologist. And he went to move to Colorado later, where he became an early, used to colleges did the majority, a college or a government organization did the large body of archaeology in our country. But in the 70s or 80s, that changes, and individuals begin creating their own private company and doing contract archaeology. There's a tremendous amount of that today. So he was one of the first contract archaeologists in South Carolina. He's very important to history, though, in our state for 2 reasons. There was a large Indian polity, a large settlement called Kofetacheki. It's pronounced several different ways. And it was long thought to be on the banks of the Savannah River. But even though we still haven't quite narrowed down where it is, it's thought to be in the Camden area now. And Steve Baker was responsible for doing all the research that determined that. But the other thing he did was in 1973, the 5,000-year-old Catawba Indian pottery tradition was almost dead. So Steve Baker arranged for there to be a show at the Columbia Museum of Art. And so he got the last 4 people. The Catawba potters had just about stopped making pottery when they could get textile mill jobs. They'd make a pot and they'd get $5 or $10 for it. It just wasn't profitable. It's an incredible amount of work. So the story goes, and I always wondered if it was true. It was true that before the night of the show, that Steve Baker went around and marked everybody's pots up incrementally. Okay. And the next day when they had the show, all the potteries sold out. It was huge. And they got the big prices for them. And so the women the 4 main potters there, like Arzada Sanders and Georgia Harris, and I think it was Edith Harris. I can't remember right now. I'm sorry, I should know this. But they were in a rush to get back to the reservation and make pots. And this is the start of what we call the Catawba Renaissance. So here he is at Sarah Ayres' house in Columbia, who was a Catawba that lived there for a long time. And a lot of people like Chris Judge knew Sarah as well. But it was just a huge, huge moment. It started a big, helped jumpstart a Catawba Renaissance that happened a lot later into the vibrant pottery tradition that exists today and continues today. And so just some of the materials he's got that we have in this collection are very important. And we have been discussing and talking with the Columbia Museum of Art. And in 2023, we're going to recreate that 1973 Columbia Museum of Art exhibit. Now, if any of you remember the old Columbia Museum of Art compared to the new one, there's quite a tremendous change. And we actually have cases hung to the wall on pegboard in that old 1973 Columbia Museum of Art, which by our standards today look quite tacky. I said, don't y'all want to put a pegboard piece of wall up and hang some pots in a case on that? And I got major kind of shushed when I brought up that idea, but I thought it was kind of cool retro. But anyway, you kind of understand what we have here. David Pittman is a resident of Kershaw who was very interested in the Catawbas. And after the Catawbas in 1993 started having the annual Dapye Iswa, the day of the Catawba, David began photographing them. So he's done a lot of videotaping. So I've got all his videotapes redone and remastered. And they're just about the only, if he hadn't done this, if he hadn't saved these, we wouldn't have any pictures or photographs of many of these Catawba elders of that time who were very important historically in the tribe who have passed on now. So this is very much an important collection also. Dr. Alice B. Kasakoff. Alice was one of the first anthropologists to study Native Americans in South Carolina. And so there's a lot of stuff here. There's a lot of information on Native American schools. Before integration, there were about 20 Native American schools in South Carolina. No one knows this now. This is a largely forgotten fact. And so Alice, there's a lot of important work. There's a lot of information here in this collection. Gene Crediford, we were honored to have him come hang out with us. He was a longtime legendary photographer for USC, and he went out and went all over it and documented Native American tribes, powwows gathering all over our state for about a 25-year period. And he donated these things to us. And once again, this was another one of those collections you despaired of, because I had like dozens and dozens of pages of photographic negatives. Gene came from the era of when you would hold that camera up and you'd hit that button and you go click, 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 click. Well, I never had the time to scan all those clicks. There might be 15 images and only one was really good in there. So, I'll tell you how we did get this process, but you can see some of the beauty of Gene's photographs here. He did a lot of oral history work. There's a lot of interesting things in his collection, a couple of thousand photographs that we have managed to pick the best of, I think, and put online. Wes Talkchere, his name was actually Wes White. He had it changed to Talkchere, which is a Catawba word for white man. He's a legend in South Carolina. He's a very eccentric individual. He's probably one of the greatest compilers of history that has ever existed. He did a lot of work on Native Americans. He donated a lot of papers to the South Carolina Historical Society. He knows so much. He worked with the Lumbee Nation for a long time, and he donated 3 sets of papers to us. We've got papers on the Edisto Natchez Cusco. We got papers on the Santee. We got papers on the Wassamasaw tribe of Varnertown Indians. And he's got a tremendous amount of genealogical information in these papers. And this really helps. So we may be getting more things from him in the future. I'm not sure. I love this picture of him. This was early days when we were spread out all over the USCO campus, and all that stuff on the wall that you see stacked up, that was the Fred Sanders collection. Fred would bring me a laundry basket full of papers every week. And I despaired of ever organizing his collection. It took several years, but I would go in there and just look at it. But at the same time, it was fun. And finally, one of our most recent collections is the David Lindsay Pettus collection. This was a dear, dear friend of mine. I spoke at his funeral. It was very rough for me to lose him. He was the go-to guy for all things history in South Carolina. His sister Louise Pettus was the go-to person for all things history in York County, Lancaster County. The archives over at Winthrop University are actually named after her. And we did so much together. And he always had a big, big interest in the Catawba. He had a large Catawba pottery collection. He donated that to us after he passed. He amassed a lot of Native American materials. And I've got most of those. And then after Lindsay got in his final office, because he was, something I should say too, is a lot of our donors, and this doesn't apply to everyone, and please, if you're listening and you're one of our donors, but a lot of our donors were pack rats. And pack rats, without pack rats, there wouldn't be any archivist. People that keep things because they know they're important, even though it's impossibly cluttered. Lindsay's office was impossibly cluttered, but it was a joy. I would dig through a stack of stuff, and suddenly I'd find a letter from 1825 laying on a pack of onion skin copy paper that Lindsay covered up maybe 20 years ago and forgot about. And so when I cleaned out of his office, there were a lot more things that came to us. I actually found an 1840 plat from the Catawba Indian boundary, and I actually have an 1811 Catawba Indian land lease in a frame that we got. So we were able to come up with a lot of things, but there wouldn't be a Native American Studies program without him. He originally purchased the Catawba Indian pottery collection from Tom Blumer, because as he said, even though the Catawbas are now in York County, all the clay for every Catawba pot ever created comes from Lancaster County, and that is very much true. And he wanted to bring Lancaster back to life to help establish a Native American Studies collection in this area, and he was huge on that. Another recent collection we required was Fred William Fisher, and he was a longtime archaeologist at UNC Charlotte. Ooh, I didn't capitalize Bill. I hate it when I find a typo in my presentation, but he was one of the first contract archaeologists. He worked at UNC Charlotte for a long, long time, and so I've got a lot of archaeological reports of things in the Charlotte areas. but he worked identifying Adena and Hopewell cultures throughout the Midwest. He worked at Cahokia. He excavated the Temple Mound at Cahokia on what is the largest mound in the United States. There's extensive journals, slides in here. The big Etowah mounds in Georgia. I found slides of him he took where they're excavating the big mound in the 1950s. I've even got Mesolithic slides from Europe in here. And the journals, he gave us like 20 feet of the journals. Like I've got a run of American archaeologists going back 75 years. I've got obscure, forgotten. I've got journal articles from the early 1900s. We got about 400 books from him. This was a wonderful, wonderful thing, because that's something else we want to do is archaeologists that have worked in this area. We want their documents and papers too, if they're willing to donate. Chris Judge has a huge archaeological library in his office. Here, I have a tremendous amount of archaeology materials, and I'm willing to bet outside of the Institute of South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology in Columbia, that we have the state's largest collection of archaeological materials. So that is the genius or the genus, or I don't know what I was trying to say there, sorry. But that's it. In 2012, we created the Native American Studies Center. It was a long time dream of ours. We'd just done our 20-year plan when the city of Lancaster came to us and said, we want to create a center downtown. We're going to renovate an old building if you guys are willing, and we've got $1 million sitting in a tourism fund. I think I intentionally blurred my memories of that picture, of that time period. We moved 1,000 pieces of pottery, packed 1,000 pieces of pottery in a 2-week period, unpacked and moved. We moved all sorts of material. You know, when we moved into here, we were definitely still recovering. The university was from rough economic times. Fortunately, Duke Power gave us a lot of money. They were doing the relicensing of the dams up and down the river. So they gave us a lot of money that allowed us to purchase exhibit cases, which are ridiculously expensive. Someone ought to do an investigation about that. We had a big insurance company in town downsizing, Kanawha. They gave us all sorts of cabinets and shelving. I've got an incredible conference room table with these cool 1980 funky purple chairs in my office that I hated at first, but grew to love. So a lot of things just came together. You know, Duke Energy just gave us some money. The city of Lancaster helped us out tremendously. Lindsay Pettus was gunning for us, helping us out as much as he could in a lot of respects. And so much positive energy came together here to create the Native American Studies Center. We also have staff here. We've got Chris Judge, our archaeologist. Stephen Criswell is our director. He's also a folklorist. Claudia Priest is a linguist, the last linguist, I think, of the Catawba language. Brittany Taylor is our curator of collections, and she's an art professor, and she's done wonderful things. And Dr. Brooke Bauer is a Catawba Indian. She's on fellowship right now up in Pennsylvania, but we just have continued to add professionals. We've also got staff here that just do amazing things for us, like Katie Scholl, who's sitting next to me right now, helping this old fossil with Zoom and hitting the right buttons. So we've got an amazing staff here. We've had 50,000 plus visitors in a 6 or 7 year period before COVID hit. I hate that I'm sitting in this building right now and it's mostly dark and the public isn't in here, but that day will pass and we will go on. So one more thing I want to talk about. I can't remember what year it was, but we wrote a big grant with the help of Digital Collections in Columbia, with the help for the Institute of Southern Studies in Columbia. And the intent of this grant was to create a digital archive, a digital South Carolina archive that features the collections we have here. We wrote a $95,000 grant. And I was like, there's no way we'll ever get this. There'll be something sexier out there. We did get the grant. I remember going down and interrupting Chris Judge's class, which you just don't do, and poking my head in there and saying, we got the grant. And he jumped up and down and yelled. I jumped up and down and yelled. And then I got to my office and my facial expression totally turned around. And I said, oh my God, what the hell did I say I was going to do? It was so much work. It just about killed me. But it turned out really good and I'm very proud of it. And it's a wonderful resource. So bear with me a minute here. I'm going to get Katie to pull it up for us, okay? Can everyone see this?
Mm-hmm.
Wave
Yes.
at me again. Okay. This is the Native American South Carolina Archive, and this is a collaboration between South Carolina Digital Collections and the legendary Kate Boyd, the Institute of Southern Studies, and the legendary Matt Simmons, and a crew that they assembled. Digital Collections did so much work for me. And Matt and his people, they're the digital gurus that knew how to put all this together. So we have several components to this, okay? One of the first is click on interviews there, Katie, please. We digitized Native American interviews, and there were several moments here that were quite interesting. And so, like, click on the Catawba there, okay, and click on Earl Robbins. Earl Robbins was a legendary potter, and you can just kind of get an idea. Click on the start there. Here's Earl Robbins talking, and we've got the video along the side.
I didn't have no pipe to go by. Okay. And I sat down, and I tried to make one. I'd work a little bit now and then on it, just a little bit at a time. Yeah. So I got it made. And then I took and got me a big wad of clay, and I made the mold for it. Okay. Well, now how'd you do that? You had this slug, right? Yes, sir. Which is bigger than the pipe would be. Yes, if it shrinks up clay, And how did you fix the clay?
Okay, you can shut it down now. Okay, escape back one tab. So you see, we don't have a tremendous amount of oral histories here yet, but we have some. Also, the way the dialogue scrolls down there with the talk, to my knowledge, no one's done that in South Carolina yet except us. So there are just, this is just a snapshot of some of South Carolina's Native American people, who they are. We want to continue to add to this. Landrum George there, Catawba, and he's traveling through Europe during World War II, and he has some very interesting discussions there. So you just kind of get an idea of some of the sorts of things we have. Another thing we have, let's click on the letter tab up there. Like I said before, from 1840 to 1843, the Catawbas had an Indian agent who reported directly to the South Carolina governor. So if something was wrong or you had a problem with the Catawba, with your agent, you wrote directly to the governor. The governor would then write to the agent. If the governor didn't trust the agent would then write to other people in Rock Hill. And so that's where we get interesting stuff. In the carpetbag era, for example, there's a Catawba agent that steals all their money. I thought it quite ironic that his name was R.L. Crook, but this is what we get if you can click on this. So one of the earliest things I have here is this is an 1849 report done after the Catawbas were forced onto the Cherokee Reservation. Scroll down the page and see if it shows up. Well, but anyway, yeah, there you go. So I went through, I made myself an attack sheet, and I started in 1865, and I got all the way up to Ben Tillman, who I don't like. I have to wash my hands a lot when they're in Ben Tillman's papers. It just creeps me out because I don't like the guy. That's just a personal aside, I'm sorry. But I went through, in the state archives in South Carolina, the governor's correspondence is unindexed. There'll be a folder that says 1884, January 1st through 4th, and there might be 30 letters in there, and nobody knows who they're from or what they are. So I got a grant, and I went over 300 linear feet of documents looking for Catawba materials. I also saved a lot of stuff about early Lancaster history too during this time. But it was amazing the things I found in these documents. And so I've went through and I had to transcribe them. I had to figure them out. And so that's what this is. This is about a 25 or 30 year snapshot of the relationship between the Catawbas and their agents. I hope at some point someone will get a grant and take this on. This is tremendously long and plodding work. But I tell you, just sitting in the archives, going through stuff that's 100 years old, pulling things out of a box that you don't know what they are. This is the equivalent of the, God, just, it doesn't get any better for an archivist, okay? Let's go to images next. These are these Gene Crediford images. I had a staff at Digital Collections that could digitize all this stuff for us. So like, click on Chicora Powwow there. You see that one on the second row? There you go. And you might have to double click. I'll go down to it. I'm sorry. Now click on it. This is just a sample of the beauty and the quality of the photographs in the Gene Crediford collection. And these are able to search tribally. We've got Indian schools, we've got Indian pottery. I didn't feature Catawba pottery or the Catawbas that much in this because they're well documented in other collections we have. We've just created a digital collection on Catawba pottery here. They just went up. So I felt like they were very well represented, and I wanted to focus on a lot more of the other tribes here. So we've got just a very rich collection of photos here. Let's get back out of that now. I can't remember how much. So this is great. We've also received too at the center, we've received a big collection of recent photographs. So we've got a lot of powwow photographs, maybe 30 or 40 years. Go to video next. Now, this is a series of films that a videographer named Bill Judge did. Chris Judge went in on them. Click on the human prehistory one there. These are marvelous. They're 6 or 7 minute films. They cover the native, click on the start, the native periods of history in our state. Wonderful K through 12 resource here. Hint, hint, hint. And this is where I've lived and explored all 3,000 acres. This is 40 Acre Rock in Lancaster County. If you've never been here, you should come.
Before history. The era of history begins with surviving written documents. During the last millenniums of the most recent ice age, after 25,000 years ago,
Let's shut that down now and let's escape out of that. So there's 6 of these, and then at the bottom, scroll down to the bottom, click on that. Sorry guys, a little bit of shameless self-promotion here. This is the Native American Studies Center several years ago. We flew a drone through the center, which was really cool. So I'm going to let you watch a little of this so you can kind of get a feel for what's in the building.
Our galleries include the Lindsay Pettus Gallery with the story of Catawba pottery, a permanent exhibit detailing a 5,000-year-old folk tradition with pieces from the world's largest collection of Catawba pots. The Red Rose Gallery has become home to year-long exhibits featuring the center's ongoing Artist-in-Residence program. The North Gallery features Share a Little of That Human Touch, documenting Native American prehistory via archaeology from the Ice Age to European contact. In our Duke Energy Gallery, we are hosting year-long exhibits featuring the various tribes in South Carolina, designed and written by the tribes. Down the hall are offices and classrooms for the Native American Studies faculty, an archaeology lab, special collections, archives, historian's office, Catawba language lab, and a folk life recording studio.
Okay, so let's get out of that. Now let's go to map. Another huge part of this is, and this may not load up right, but this is a map of South Carolina, and we have Native American cultural heritage things listed on this. We went through and we called every little historical society, every museum, every academic institute, and we said, do you have Native American collections? So they're on here. This is a list of all the places regionally that have this sort of thing.
Brent, are you screen sharing? Because I can't see it.
Oh,
Are you screen sharing?
should be. Did you see earlier parts of it?
No. How about anyone else having trouble seeing it?
I can see it.
Okay, must just be mine.
Okay, good. I was worried I just did all that talking for nothing. Okay.
Go ahead. Sounds like they're seeing it.
Yeah,
So this is just a map of cultural things within our state. And you can click on it, most of them, and if there's a link there, it'll take you to it. So let's go to the next thing, the timeline. Now the timeline was exhaustive. Scroll down to the bottom of the page, Katie, and let's look at modern period. But the timeline was exhaustive. Chris Judge and me spent a lot of time on this. So click on show timeline. And there's a lot that needs to be added to this, very much. Click on the first one there, the first little gray tab. But you'll see like Catawbas meet with George Washington, 1791. And then click on the more there underneath it. No, go back. Yeah, go under the, yeah, see where it says more under 1791. Okay, so there you go. There's George Washington's diary talking about meeting the Catawbas in 1791. It wasn't very nice. He was kind of dismissive of them, but that's what we've done. We've got links. We've got historical things that have happened here. We've got links to accounts of them. We've got links to the South Carolina Encyclopedia, just all sorts of venues. We'll have a link. We'll give you a moment of a historical period, and then there's links to where you can get other more information. And this is very incomplete. There's a lot that needs to be added to it. More needs to be fleshed out, but we've come quite a way with it so far. Let's escape back out. And finally, the last thing, can we reduce that to get over to the tribes tab? Yeah, well, I think you can click and drag that down. Yeah, and the last thing we have in this is communities. So here in each one of these things, federally recognized tribes, state recognized groups, unrecognized, these are South Carolina's Native American entities, and this is the history that they have provided us about their tribe, along with their tribal crest. So this is the Native American South Carolina Archive. It will be added to in the future. It probably won't be me doing it, but this is the start of a wonderful thing that will be hosted, that will be kept, that will exist for future generations of South Carolinians. So this concludes my talk, everyone. Give me a minute to figure out how to get my face back, and we'll go into questions. All right. So questions, or there's some in the chat format there.
You might want to turn your mics off, or turn off your mute and unmute if you want to ask a question.
Okay, I do see a question. Do you know anything about the Pine Hill tribe in Lower Richland County? I heard that they were moved off the land when Fort Jackson was created. And yes, I do. Their tribal leader, Chief Michelle Wise Mitchum, is a friend. We've done a lot of work together. She actually donated some materials her and the tribe did to us. There were actually programs done at the Native American school in her area. And on NASCA, the Native American South Carolina Archive website we just looked at, there is a tribal history there provided by the Pine Hill Indians. Okay, so what's that saying about the Gullah? And bottom, last question on the bottom. Gullah people and native tribes in the coastal area interacted. Is there any information on how that is? To my knowledge, and Chris or somebody could chime in here, to my knowledge, there's not. That is kind of one of the great missing areas of history in our state. What were the interactions between the Catawba, not the Catawba, the Native Americans and the Blacks? In some cases, there's racial intermarriage. In other cases, like with the Catawba, they kind of adopted white racial attitudes and actually even hunted runaway slaves and things like that. And were very adamant against any racial admixture for a long time on their reservation. The only account I have anywhere that I've been able to find is by a Catawba named Billy Corrichie George, who, and there's an antebellum account there of where Billy was the overseer on the plantation owner's land. And the plantation owner told Billy, the Native American, to go whip the African American, and they went behind the barn, and Billy just hit the whip on the side of the barn, and the African American screamed, and that's it. That's all we know. We know there's a marvelous, wonderful history there, but unfortunately for African Americans and Native Americans, the whites just didn't think they were worthy of history. You'll always see these old photographs of here's an Indian or here's a Black person doing this, but we never have their names because they're kind of considered unimportant in that time, and that's sad. So to my knowledge, there's not a whole lot. Now, we did go to a folklore retreat several years ago, and Becky Garris and Caroline Sanders, Catawba Potters, went with us, and we went to the Gullah Festival, and there were several Gullahs at this Folklorists in the South retreat. And there was a wonderful shared narrative there between these Gullah women and these Catawba women about how they grew up. They made the pottery, they made the baskets so they could survive, so they could eat. How they grew up on the side of a road, peddling their pottery, walking, peddling their wares. And so there were very much a shared cultural narrative between the people, which kind of tells me that it was probably that way for a long, long time. But unfortunately, I don't know much more of it than that. And unfortunately, I also have a tendency to throw up on you when I ask you a question. I'll give you way much more than you know. Okay, let's see. What have I got here? I know sometimes the Seminoles adopted runaways into their tribe. It's interesting how the tribal philosophies changed and how some were more aggressively defensive of themselves. But there is such an interesting intertwine of marginalized people. And you bringing up how one guy changed the birth certificates to say that all natives were Black is wild and just absurd. Was he worried they were getting better treatment than the Black people and wanted them all treated poorly? That's a very good question because, you know, and it's still part of history today. Everyone comes to me and they want to trace their Native American ancestry. Well, you know, if your family's been in the South for a long time, you've probably got some African American ancestry too. But no one wants to cherish that. No one wants to embrace that. They have this image in their mind of Native Americans and the spirituality and the noble savage and all these things they've heard. But the African American history is not something they want to embrace. And I find that quite sad. We're all a mix of, many of us are a mix of many races and cultures. If we go back in our history, it's amazing what we're finding out as we do our DNA now and find some of our background. But the Seminoles are a wonderful story. I always tell everybody before 1819, we always hear about the Runaway Railroad, but before 1819, all you had to do was get to Florida to be free. That's another reason Andy Jackson invaded the place. But so if you could make it to Florida, and the Seminoles are an admixture of runaway slaves, of Native Americans that head out in the swamps. And, you know, the Seminoles fought 3 great wars against the United States and they never surrendered. And that's kind of the amazing thing about them. So yes, tribal philosophies do change. Membership changes. You know, the Constitution of the United States gives the Native Americans the right to determine their tribal role as they see fit. Some of them do it by blood quantum. Some of them do it by descent. Maybe out west where the numbers are a lot more, you can do it by blood quantum. But my personal opinion is that the American government created blood quantum so Native Americans would breed out and disappear and just vanish. And we see a lot of that. But that kind of gets me. Somebody will come up and say, I'm 1/16 Cherokee, you know, or, you know, how that works out. And it's kind of sad too, because it's just blood quantum's a difficult thing. Let me see. So is there anything there? You know, we're talking more about Plecker here. One guy changed birth certificates to say that all Native were Black. As near as I know, Plecker's thoughts were that nobody was really Native American anymore. They were all tainted by Black ancestry, and that therefore they were lying, you know, and trying to pass as white, which you didn't do. I don't know if many of you are older, saw the old Ethel Waters movie. No, it wasn't Ethel Waters, but the old Imitation of Life back in the 50s about the Black girl who had enough white ancestry that she could pass. And that's very much a part of Indian culture. You know, your parents could pass for white, so they moved away where you would have opportunities that you wouldn't have here because people knew where you came from. And that was always going to hold you back, and you never have a chance to advance in this world. So once again, I threw up on you. I'm sorry. Any other question, anyone?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I've lost sight of you on my screen. So, and I typed a message, but I don't know what happened to it.
Oh, hold on.
So here in Columbia, close to the VA off of Garner's Ferry Road. Do you know anything about it? How do we find out about it and work on it? And my second question to you is, I would like to work with you, work for you. How do I contact you?
Okay. Can you hear me now though?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay. Now you kind of came and went a little bit there. You said an Indian mound on Garner Ferry Road?
Yeah, there is a road. that is called Indian Mound Road. No one seems to know anything about it. It does sit, there is quite an incline with houses built on it at this point, and there has been an addition put on it on the road. I cannot find anything about it, but I'm sure that there is an incredible history to it. It's probably within a couple of miles from Fort Jackson, but it sits almost right across from the VA. To one side of the
We try to
residential.
keep those things secret because the local whites will go in there and dig. People go out
Yes,
for
yes.
archaeological sites all the time. Chris Judge, do you know about this site? Is this something you could chime in for me?
Yes.
Okay.
There is a recorded site in the floodplain of Gills Creek
Okay, that's the area. All right.
near Indian Mound Road.
Mhm.
Now, whether that's actually a mound or a piece of high ground, which are often mistaken for mound, we don't know. But the artifacts that are recorded from there are what we call the Deptford period, the woodland period. They're about 2,500 years old.
Okay.
And that is a time when Native Americans in South Carolina and the Eastern United States were building small burial mounds. But to my knowledge, the mound itself has not been located, but there is a site of that period. You also may remember the old Cedar Terrace Pharmacy up on Garner's Ferry Road was covered in artifact frames that came from that area around the Wood Hill.
Okay. That pharmacy would have been before my time, before moving down here
It's
from North Carolina.
I've been gone for 15 years, yeah. That's what I know.
Okay. Well,
All right.
I mean, I've always felt like I drive through there every day, and I always think that there's something there, without a doubt. And there is some high ground that slopes down into Gills Creek. But sometime probably beginning in the 1970s and 80s, they started building houses in the area.
All right. So can I, or do you have anything else to ask, or can I go on and finish answering the big question I didn't?
Okay. All right. I'm done.
Thank you. Thank you. I've got another question. It says the recent ruling by the Supreme Court giving more land to the tribes that semi helps to keep one of the million promises broken was wonderful. Do you think there is a chance that there are some broken treaties that could go to court here with regards to land, or any other mistreatment broke from federal Native agreements? That's a hard one. I mean, the Catawbas fought a bitter, they regained federal recognition in the 1940s. The Eisenhower administration had a policy called termination. Let's make them give up this land that we're keeping them on, so they'll assimilate in and be normal Americans, and we won't have to help them out or do anything for them. And so this was kind of unlawful, and many tribes went to court. The Catawbas reorganized in the 70s. They fought a bitter 23-year legal battle to regain federal recognition, which they did in the 1993s. Their only recourse finally to get it was to sue each individual landowner on the original 15 square mile reservation. So that was everybody that lived in Rock Hill, everybody at Winthrop, everybody in Tega Cay, Fort Mill, and it got nasty. And that's when people started coming to the table, and there was a flawed settlement there. And the sad thing is about once or twice a year, I will hear from a Rock Hill resident at that time who comes up and tells me about those damn dirty Indians and how they tried to take their land. So yes, Native Americans have suffered greatly. Native Americans continue to suffer greatly. If you will notice the whole Standing Rock thing a few years ago, back during the 2016 election, when they were protesting this big pipeline coming through ancient tribal lands. I'm not going to say anything good or bad about the current. Yes, I am. The current administration did one thing wonderful. Trump did give federal recognition to the 6 tribes in Virginia that have been there for hundreds of years. And that's amazing. There are now over 530 recognized Indian nations in the United States of America. The majority are in California, which is a shocker to most people. They just don't think of Native Americans being there. The bad thing is a lot of these sacred tribal lands, especially out west now, they've reduced the size of national monuments. They're allowing drilling. A lot of big mining interests and things like that are coming out there. There was a big article several years ago, I need to go back and look this up, about how Native American tribes own most of the United States uranium. How's that one going to pan out for the future? You know, I mean, will they be forced off that land? But yes, there's still very much a movement afoot to keep Native Americans in a place and not let them advance and move forward. There's a tremendous amount of prejudice in many areas still. On the plus side, though, we now have 3 Native American women in the U.S. House. We've got about 6 Native Americans, male and female, in the U.S. House now. And this is a very positive thing and something for the future. And then the last question, I promise it's quite grim. Do you know of any mass graves, similar to how we've recently been finding mass graves from the massacres of Black people and oral histories, that haven't been confirmed by science, yet are likely to exist? And then there's a next question that says, what was the prevailing burial tradition of South Carolina Native Americans? Chris Judge, you're in the building. You know I'm going to make you answer those questions because I don't know. So please chime in again for us.
Question was, what was the primary burial practice
Of South Carolina Native Americans?
There were many. There's cremation, secondary burials where the bones are defleshed and bundled, primary inhumations where people are just buried in the ground. Sometimes they're buried in mounds. There are ossuaries where many, even hundreds of individuals are buried in a single pit. So quite a few different ways of burying.
Okay, thank you. And I think that kind of handles the previous question too. I'm not aware of anything like mass grave from a massacre or something like that, but he's saying mass graves is just in more like kind of, that was just where the Native Americans kind of put a lot of people after they passed. So any more questions here? Anything else from anyone? If you haven't typed it out, you want to chime in and ask something? Well, I guess we are finished then, John.
Okay, Brent, well, could you make me the host, please? Just right click on my name and make me the host so I can.
Right click on his name. Hold on a sec. There he is, John Jameson.
We can do without it if we have to.
Where's that at?
Keep scrolling down. Okay. Make host, yeah. There we go.
All right. Well, Brent, thanks so much for that lecture. It was very interesting. And some people have asked if this has been recorded. You recorded it on your end, Brent, right? And
hopefully, I think Chris said he was going to do it. I hope he did.
Yeah, and we want to make these available if possible for people to look at later. So if I think I have it recorded on my machine, but if not, I will get with you and see if we can set up a link or a way to get that transferred over here to our system. I wanted to, again, thank everybody for attending. Our next Zoom session is going to be on 18th century culture. And we're going to be talking about Fort Congaree 1, Saxe-Gotha, some of the naturalist explorers, a history of the Casey House, and other topics on Tuesday, November 10th, same time. So please tune in for that. And Brent, again, thanks so much. I think this kind of talk is, there's a lot of curiosity about the archive, and you've answered a lot of those questions. I'm sure you'll be getting a lot of follow-up communications too, because most people just didn't know anything about it. Now they know more and can ask more questions. And we hope to perhaps have you back again. As I've mentioned, we may continue these programs in the spring if we're not able to get back out in the park, at the 12,000 Year History Park. Once we do get back out, please come to the park. It's near the Casey Tennis Center on Fort Congaree Trail, 1120 Fort Congaree Trail. We have a little under 400 acres of natural cultural history there. So hope to see you on the program on November 10th. Brent, thanks very much.
Thank you for having me.
I guess we can cast off if there are no more questions. Okay, thank you. Thanks for everyone for attending.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Bye.
All right.
Bye-bye.